can you get into the story a little bit about then how you learned
Sure.
that the children were going to go back to their parents?
Yeah, absolutely. So after about, over almost a year and a half or so, the court was ruling in favor of them staying with us for another 6 months. And at that point, I had in my head that, look, they're probably going to go home, but I don't really know. And they're not ready at this point. The parents were both in rehab centers. They had another child who was allowed to stay with them at the rehab center. And so, so they were making some progress, but there was still things like every time they were with them, they really didn't pay any attention to the younger of the two boys. It was like almost as if they were like afraid to talk to him or not. They were just sort of indifferent in some way.
Yeah. Maybe they felt like they didn't know him, kind of.
I'm sure in part that was it. I mean, they'd only had him for, about maybe 6 weeks before he was taken. And then he went to live with the grandmother before they came to us. So there was a lot of that. Right. And then I think, so then that court ruled that way, but we had been told early on that the mother had, the pro bono attorney that was given to her when the boys were detained had asked her if she wanted to appeal the decision to have the boys detained from her. And she did. And we were told that, everybody appeals. It's just standard practice, but nobody ever wins. Don't even give it another thought. And so we really didn't. And it turns out she won her appeal. And so we found this out a few days after that court ruling that would have had them with us for about 6 more months. And so we sort of went into this tailspin of like, all right, they might be ready to go home in 6 months. They might not, but they're certainly not now. And so you could see this like mad scramble on behalf of, the county agency where they were trying to get more visits in and they were trying to get them to spend more time with each other because at this point it was out of their hands. And I think they knew the same thing we knew, but no one else was willing to say it but us. And there was a nonprofit that we had worked with that, was definitely aligned with us on this too. But it was really, it was hard just because you didn't know what's going to happen. And then if they go home, it was never about, can this family love them or another sort of, it's like, but can they keep them safe? And that was my fear.
Talk about, I've heard you mention about the judge and you didn't feel like the judge really knew the players in the case. And there was so much work that seemed to go into it with the caseworkers about getting the paperwork done and getting the facts in. But then it seemed like the judge didn't really pay attention to any of that. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, it was just interesting. It was like one day we're sitting in court, with the family, and then 6 months later we're back there. And this time they have another baby and she's, bouncing the baby in her lap. And the judge says, "Oh, who's this?" And I'm just thinking to myself, I'm like, wait, you don't know that they had another kid? Like, it was just so like, so you're about to rule whether or not they can have 3 kids under the age of 3. And you don't know that. I mean, you were only thinking about the 2. You didn't realize like there was this new wild card thrown in here.
Right.
It's just like, I was like, where is the breakdown in communication? How many cases are going through this judge's office that he can't follow it? I mean, it seemed awful, there was just too much.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask like what you've learned about this system. I mean, do you think they're too overwhelmed? There's too many kids going through the system that people's stories really aren't being heard. I mean, do you think the kids are safe? Do you think they are being protective?
No, God, that's a really hard question because I think that I think there's probably too many kids coming in or kids that are coming in needlessly, right? Because I think we over surveil certain communities, especially communities of color in this country, and we over police them. And as a result, we're taking in more kids that are Black, brown, Indigenous than we should be. And we're overlooking other kids that maybe are being neglected too.
Right.
So I think that is a problem. That being said, I think that one of the biggest, falsehoods that we have is that neglect is poverty. And, lots of kids grow up or adults have grown up in poverty and go on to do wonderful things. And, it's a loving home doesn't have to be rich, but we could do a lot more to help families that are struggling that, to make ends meet, to feed their children, to keep a roof over their head. Families that want the help and that are willing to, that are able to care for their kids absolutely should. And I think too often poverty is a reason kids are taken away from their families.
Right. It's interesting that you mentioned what you just were saying about how some kids are taken away needlessly, and other kids are completely overlooked. I think when you look at the news, I mean, at least where I live, I live between New York and Florida, and there are so many stories about kids who have died at the hands of their parents because they were neglected, left at home in a playpen while mother goes on vacation. Parents who are keeping their children in a box in their house, not feeding them. I mean, terrible situations. And then also there's a situation like, I don't know if you're familiar with Maya Kowalski, where she was a girl who was, CPS came in and took her, she became awarded to the state, because her parents brought her into the hospital and asked for them to give her ketamine to help a sickness she had. And they blamed the parents and thought the parents were trying to make their daughter sick and all this. And needless to say, the mother ended up killing herself because she was so upset that they wouldn't allow her to see her child. And later on, just this past year, Johns Hopkins had to pay over $220 million to the family for wrongfully taking the child away from the parents. So, I mean, it's just terrible stories like this on either side. And I personally know, I think at least 3 families that have told me about how they bring their kid into the hospital and they're asked a series of questions and they almost thought they were about to get in trouble. Like, a friend of mine who had their kid had taken, when you make mac and cheese and it's the hot water and the kid was 4 and had taken the little dish out of the microwave and spilled hot water all over his chest and got 3rd-degree hurt or whatever. And the hospital blamed the parents, and it was like terrible situation. And when it was a complete accident. So, there are just so many like incompetent caregivers, in that area.
Yeah.
Not caregivers, excuse me, but caseworkers in that area that are not paying attention to the facts. Can you talk about competent versus incompetent?
Yeah, I mean, I think, just thinking about that situation, it's one of those where, that you were just talking about, it's one of those where, you kind of do have to ask those questions, though, because if, God forbid, it was a child abuse situation and they left the kid in there, but on the flip side, it's like accidents do happen. Like, so, it's important that they differentiate between which one is an accident and which is intentional. And that's, but yeah, it's really hard. We had a bunch of social workers that we worked with throughout our case, and, all but one were very good and great at their job, and I'm very candid in the book about the one that wasn't, but the situation for us was, and these caseworkers oftentimes have too many cases. We had one social worker, I called her Kendra in the book. She had over 45 cases. There was a day when the older boy had fallen, like he just tripped and banged his head. And so, of course, we ran him to the ER and did everything that we were supposed to do. And she didn't call me back for 3 days. And this was early on after they got there. And I was thinking like, oh God, I can't believe this is what it is. This is what, social workers, they stink, And then I was like, oh, when I finally heard from her, she was like, hey, look, I'm really sorry. It was the weekend and I had, I have 45 current cases. And she wasn't being defensive, by the way, either. She was like, I have 45 cases right now. She's like, and I was actually chasing 2 kids that were on an Amber Alert right now. So I knew, she's like, I have all these open cases with all these different kids in different houses, and I don't leave your house and then worry about the safety of the boys. Like, I know that you and Jason are competent and they're going to be taken care of. And I'm not I trust that. And so yours aren't the ones I'm worried about.
Yeah.
And which made me feel good about, her having her vote of confidence. But then I was also like, oh God, I'm such a fool for not, recognizing that she has so much work. She's so overworked. And that's when you think about how does stuff fall through the cracks? It's like, I get it. For situations like her, if she were to lose something through the cracks, you have to give her the grace because she's overworked. There's not enough social workers, doing what she's doing.
Yeah.